question we do have is there anyone here who would like not to be videotaped? We have a camera here, and we will be videotaping our speakers and questions from the audience unless you prefer not to be. Is there anyone who would like not to be?
As long as it doesn't show up on YouTube. And I don't want to ask any questions. Anyone who
There you go. All right, so I'm assuming we all are prepared to be.
You can still ask your questions, I just won't take you. We'll just take the presenters. Yeah.
As long as you get me from my left side. We're here.
Okay.
Just get me from the back.
Okay.
You don't have to shoot me.
I'm delighted to say that we have three people here that I think will make this a very interesting time together. To my left over there is Ayush Shah, who is Jane, and each of these persons will be introducing themselves a bit more as they begin their presentation. To his right, then, will be Beverly George, who is Sakai Gakkai Buddhist and a local professor in our community college system. And then to my immediate left will be Sid Shahid, who is Muslim. And each of these will be speaking from their respective faith traditions on the topic of compassion. We're delighted you're here and appreciate so much your coming. And I think Professor George, you're first. You are.
Good morning. So nice to see you all. I'd like to just give you a very short introduction to myself, Evelyn George. I am a Buddhist from the Soka Gakkai International Sect, and Soka Gakkai means Value Creation Society. It is a Buddhist sect founded in the 13th century by a Japanese monk from Japan. The organization was founded by two educators who were opposed to war. So the idea of creating value absolutely includes creating and understanding compassion. Our particular Buddhist practice is based on one of the historical Buddhist sutras, which is called the Lotus Sutra. Everything we do in our practice is based on what the Buddha taught us. And that particular sutra really talks about compassion in an all-encompassing way. And so what I thought I'd like to do with you is to read just one part of that Lotus Sutra. And it is from the Peaceful Practices chapter. And after I have read that particular piece, I will go on to explain how Nichiren Daishonin, the founder, was able to use this as a basis to develop this practice of Buddhism. The Buddha is speaking to one of his disciples, and the disciple's name is Manjushri. Here's what he says. Manjushri, if among these bodhisattvas and masattvas, there are those who in the age hereafter, when the law is about to perish, accept and embrace the Lotus Sutra, toward believers who are still in the household or those who have left the household, they should cultivate a mind of great compassion. And toward those who are not bodhisattvas, they should also cultivate a mind of great compassion and should think to themselves, these persons have made a great error. Though the dust come one as an expedient means, preaches the law, and the dust come one is the Buddha, in accordance with what is appropriate, they do not listen, do not know, although these persons do not inquire, do not believe, and do not understand. But although these persons do not inquire about, believe, understand the sutra, when I have attained Anuttara Samyutta Sambuddhi, wherever I may be, I will employ my transcendental powers and the power of wisdom to draw them to me and cause them to abide in this law. The law is Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. Heavenly beings day and night will, for the sake of the law, constantly guard and protect them and will cause all listeners to rejoice. Why? because this sutra is protected by the supernatural powers of all Buddhas of the past, future, and present. And so as the Buddha talks about compassion, Nichiren Daishonin, who is the founder of our sect, then went on to talk about Buddhist compassion based on what the Buddha is trying to explain in this passage. And what he said was removing suffering and giving joy. That is what the Daishonin's mission was. He said to take the suffering of all living beings is what compassion is all about. He said in this world there is so much self-centeredness that people constantly functioning thinking first of themselves and then only of others when necessary. He said, with regard to all living beings, one should think of them with great compassion. Buddhism is a teaching of compassion that seeks to help people become happy, defeating the injustice that brings about human misery. The compassion of Buddha's enlightenment is expressed in the human behavior of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva. This statement makes it clear that anyone and everyone possesses the potential of a Bodhisattva, the potential to behave with compassion towards another person. So what is a Bodhisattva? A Bodhisattva is a being who aspires to attain Buddhahood and carries out various altruistic practices in order to achieve that goal. Compassion is the outstanding characteristic of the Bodhisattva who postpones his or her own entry into nirvana in order to assist others to gain enlightenment. The Bodhisattva figure is particularly important in Mahayana Buddhism. So Nichiren Daishonin, the founder, used the sutra that the Buddha talked about compassion and how it should be used and how we should view each other, and then went on to teach that concept to his followers. And I will stop right there and pass it on, and we'll come back to this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Tex and Dr. Effinger and Ann and all of you, thank you very much for being here. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Sid Shahid. I actually am, I was born in Pakistan, but I've been here ever since second grade. So I'm sort of a native of Colorado, at least I consider myself, and I'm just glad to be in Arizona now that I don't have to shovel any driveways. So very glad to be here. All my life, pretty much, I've been really passionate about what America is all about, and that's what really has sort of motivated me. And I'll sort of get into that a little bit more. Essentially, I went to college in Colorado, and then worked for the U.S. government mainly all my jobs. So I've been a civil servant all my life. I basically worked for the U.S. Department of Defense for 13 years, and also worked for the U.S. Department of Education. I work for HUD now. Aside from that, I have my own consulting company where I sort of focus on de-radicalization and also the whole concept of sort of providing a link or a bridge to those people in my faith who are refugees from foreign lands, who are just assimilating themselves in a foreign culture and sort of imparting upon themselves that there's nothing in the American way of life that actually gets into practicing of their faith. And that's, I think, where compassion begins, and that's where I'd like to get started about compassion. Essentially, if you look at the holy book of Islam, which is the Holy Quran, 114 chapters of the Quran, with the exception of one, basically starts out referring to a remark about God. It says, I begin in the name of God, the compassionate and the merciful. So compassion, even at the very sort of inception of everything that is sort of, and of course Muslims believe that the Quran is the very literal and authentic word of God, begins with compassion. It's a very, very important concept of compassion. every particular task that a Muslim begins with, whether it be drinking of water, eating of food, taking an exam, what have you, we begin with the word Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which means I begin in the name of God, the beneficent and the merciful and compassionate. So compassion to us is a very, very important thing in Islam. Now, it isn't with some Muslims, but it is in Islam, and I make that distinction also. We have a number of sort of vehicles in our faith to exhibit our compassion, namely zakat, which is giving charity. So we are required, as an article of our faith, to give 2.5% of our yearly wealth to the needy, to the poor, to orphans, to perhaps widows who don't have a means of support, what have you. We also have, as another vehicle of compassion, something called Suwam, which is fasting. So in the 9th month of the lunar month of Ramadan, which I'm sure you've heard about, we fast from daybreak to when the sun goes down. And basically the main reason behind that is that we want to realize sort of the plight of the hungry, the plight of the poor. So that sort of exhibits that we should have compassion towards those who certainly don't have, as much as we do. And our compassion, in a way, is really exhibited not just towards people of our own faith, but to all people. And when you look at our faith, one of the most powerful depictions is exhibited in the Golden Rule, which is exhibited to our faith, which basically says, and I'll quote a hadith. The hadith is something that the Prophet Muhammad at one point said, is that none of you are truly believers until he wishes for his brother that what he wishes for himself. So the act of compassion is sort of spread out, not simply towards your family, or towards your friends, or towards those with faith, but towards all people. And I would just like to conclude with one small verse of the Quran, which I think is particularly important. It's in chapter 3, verse 133 and 134. So it sort of shows you, what compassion means to us. And it refers to, and I'm going to sort of paraphrase here, it refers to forgiveness as a race. So in other words, we should be very quick to forgive, right? We should be very quick to forgive because we want that same forgiveness from our God. And then it also talks about sort of spending to help those who are needy. And it talks about spending not simply in times of prosperity, but also in times of adversity. And that's not really one's favorite step, that you should spend your money, maybe, if you have $5, spend 30 cents helping someone who doesn't even have 30 cents. So that's the act of spending for you. And the last thing I want to sort of conclude with is it talks about restraining anger, this faith does. And it talks about restraining anger and pardoning all, not just Muslims, not just whoever. Very specifically mentioned the word all. And I wish, and it's my prayer and it's my hope, that in the future, Muslims really look at their scripture and really see what their scripture is saying, as opposed to sort of, and I've written a number of articles about radicalization, counterterrorism is my field. That's what I've lectured on, that's what I talk about and write about. So I'm happy to discuss that with you. But these are the elements of the faith that the compassion is resolved around. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it on to someone who knows more than I do.
Thank you, Sid. I'll introduce myself. I'm Piyush Shah. I represent the Jain faith. I came to the United States in '79 to do my master's in chemical engineering and just stayed here, and I've been here since that time. And in fact, I've spent more time here in the United States than in India now. So anyway, it's been a fun thing here. And I moved to Arizona in '84. So I've been almost a native, if you think of that many years I spent in Arizona. So I'll talk about compassion from Jain perspective, what it means. So I'll start out with the quote from our 24th Tirthankar, His name is Bhagwan Mahavir, and he was almost a contemporary of Buddha. So he lived almost 2600 years ago, Bhagwan Mahavir. And it's the quote that we use as a Jain golden rule. So the quote is, a man should wander about treating all creatures as he himself would be treated. The emphasis is on the word all creatures. So the compassion is not just limited to fellow human beings, but compassion is expanded to include all living beings. So whether it's an ant crawling right here or a scorpion in your house, they are all living beings. We believe that all living beings have a soul, and life is dear to everybody, not just to you and me. If you try to kind of scare the scorpion, it kind of crawls, right? I mean, it tries to protect itself, although it cannot. If you have a large shoe with you and you kind of smack it, it doesn't, right? So the compassion is expanded to all living beings. That's one that is reflected in our also day-to-day life, and I'll share that with you a little bit later. The other one is that actually there is interdependence. The word we use is paraspar graha jivana, meaning all of us are mutually dependent on each other. So there's a famous science experiment that says a butterfly flapping his wings in Amazon can affect the weather pattern in Europe, for example, which means that every little action we do here has an impact as far as the environment is concerned. And so if you kill someone or hurt someone, that vibration is somehow going to affect us eventually. So what goes around, what comes around. So it is in our best interest to be compassionate with all living beings because we are part of the one ecosystem. So Jainism invented ecology, I think, before ecology was a really green word nowadays, right? So anyway, so I want to share with you that also. So basically, compassionate in its simplest terms means helping those who are less fortunate than you are. So if you are a millionaire, you should help somebody who is less of a millionaire. If you only got $5, then you should share 30 cents, as Sid mentioned. So you can help in any which way you can, depending on your situation. It's not like only Bill Gates can help others. You can help others every day. And in fact, charity is one of the 6 essential duties of Jains. So I remember growing up in India, when we, after a meal, and if there is any leftover, my mom would send me and my brothers and say, oh, okay, go out on the street and find someone who needs food and just donate the food. And it's a little difficult in the United States to find that, but in India there was not a problem. You go around the street, you'll find somebody. So that's how we got trained in compassion when we were child. The other ways is the Jains are vegetarian by birth. Again, eating meat is not considered as a compassion to the living beings who are at higher form. Some may argue that yes, you're eating plants, and it is plant, but that's a very smallest form of life. So we call it as living is killing, but best living is least killing. Meaning, minimize violence in your life, and in many different ways you can do it. We believe that even water, earth, fire, everything is made up of living things. In one sense, living things, smaller living things. So if you're taking a shower and you think about, say, how can I show compassion to those living beings in the water? Well, the simplest way is if you're taking a 40-minute shower, cut down to 30 minutes. If you're taking a 30-minute shower, you can cut down to 20 minutes. This is how you can show compassion even in the smallest things you do. So that's very obvious. You're taking some action. But the compassion is also, it should be in your thought and in your speech. So, and not just in action. Even though eventually everything what ends up in action starts from your thought. So if your thought is pure, if thought is your compassion, if you show compassion in your thoughts, in your speech, then it will show up in your action. So it doesn't result in action automatically. So that's why your thought and speech are very important. And you can say, okay, how can I show compassion with my speech? Well, you can show compassion if somebody is gossiping about somebody and you participate in it. That is not showing compassion. Showing compassion is avoiding the gossip. You can say only those things which are pleasing to others, that instead of hurting others. So that's how you can show compassion. So compassion can be shown in many, many different ways through your thought, speech, and action. And lastly, I would like to just end with just a prayer. It's very simple, and it just summarizes what I've said. Let my thoughts be full of compassion for all living beings. Let my speech be full of compassion for all living beings. Let my actions be full of compassion for all living beings. Jai Jinendra. Thank you.
All right, I think we are now at a place where we can entertain questions or comments from you. Paul?
I'd like to ask a question of each one of you. From your faith, not especially from you individually, but from your faith, what is your concept of compassion toward some groups that some parts of society say are unwelcome? For example, we've gone through here in Arizona in the last year or so the illegal immigrants sort of thing. What does your faith say about showing compassion for persons like that? Or homosexuals. Many people in our society say gay and lesbian persons should be pushed away and shut out from our society, from our places of worship, etc. What does your faith say about those two groups or anyone else that society pushes out?
I'd like to address that from several perspectives. The first is that my faith is all-inclusive. The organization that I belong to, Soka Gakkai International, is one of the most diverse religious organizations in the world. As a matter of fact, we have a very large pride group, homosexuals, people of different backgrounds. And I think the beauty of understanding that the Buddhist concept of all-inclusiveness, and it's because we're taught that everyone is totally equal, that in the eyes of the Buddha, in the eyes of the universe. What I like so much about this practice is that the universal law sees not color, face, race, size, but looks at the essence of the human being. Looks at what is in your heart, because that is where we're all equal. That is where we're all human beings. And so we're focusing not necessarily on the external, but on the internal essence, spirit, and life of human beings. And it makes absolutely no difference. When it comes to people that are excluded, we sort of take a vow. When Dushan says, I take on the suffering of other people, he really taught us that it is our responsibility to really use that compassion, to experience the suffering that these people are going through, and to never ever denounce anyone's race, religion, attitude, political intention, but to look at the human condition, the people who are illegal, what brought them here, what are the true issues. How can we look at their situation because they are human? What Theo said about interdependence comes into play here. So what is it these people are suffering, and how can we as compassionate brothers and sisters extend a hand to really help these people overcome the issue, or to help them understand how they can help themselves? Because I think part of the misnomer in terms of compassion, sometimes people call it pity, but there's a big difference. Because compassion is not just helping other people. It is taking on the suffering but helping them to help themselves overcome that suffering by giving them the tools that they need. And so each religion, be it Jains, be it Muslim, have the same dictum. We are responsible for helping people overcome their suffering. It doesn't matter what religion we're in because they're human beings.
That was beautiful. That was very good. Look, I'm in a unique sort of position here in terms of my particular faith has really not undergone the reformation that many other faiths have. So in that sense, I think it's incumbent upon people like myself and other Muslims that we really have some very open and candid sort of conversation about this because we certainly need to. And as a Muslim, by the way, I went to Catholic schools, so that sort of shows that I am. My parents, as a child, didn't really see any sort of issue in terms of me learning goodness as a Muslim, because goodness, as my medical colleagues here mentioned, is contained not just in my faith. It's not sort of the monopoly of my faith, but it's the monopoly of all faiths, and that's what I learned in the interfaith movement. When we look at everyone who is part of our group, it's just so beautiful because different people represent the same concepts, but they're represented differently. So, in that sense, I would like to quote a verse from the Quran. It says, it's chapter 49, verse 13. And it says, O mankind, we created you from one man and one woman, and created you into nations and tribes, that you should honor each other, not that you should despise each other. And indeed, the most honorable of you in the eyes of God are those who are the most righteous. So, in that sense, when you look at it, basically it's God who judges people, right? And God waits till the end of a person's days, at least I believe, to make a judgment on a person. Why should you not? I am in no position to comment on people who are illegal. Maybe they have their own reasons. Everybody wants, a better, nicer, more sumptuous apple. I know I do, and everyone else does too. Everyone has the right to improve themselves. People make choices in life, and as long as they don't affect other people, how they try to live, how they try to behave, what they try to do, is really not an issue that I need to be sort of concerned about. Those are the sort of issues that we need to be aware of and be accepting of. And as you can see, the verse that I read from the Quran, it really makes you think that if God wanted every person to be straight and not gay, God would not have created people such as like that. If God wanted people not to be Buddhists and all Muslims, God would have created all Muslims. Well, God didn't. And that tests us all. That tests my faith the most because, quite frankly, when you look at certain countries, that practice my faith, and they have been extremely dogmatic in treating some of the people. We look at Iran, and crazy man Ahmadinejad mentions that, there are no homosexuals in Iran. Well, it's ridiculous. They kill them all, and that's why. It's wrong on a moral level, it's wrong on an ethical level, and it's actually wrong on a religious level. And again, everything they said about forgiveness, everything they said about compassion, everything. These are sort of the authentic, at least as a Muslim, I believe, the authentic words of God. And if I can't really abide by those, if I sort of become someone who practices dogma and say, hey, these people are okay and these people are not, well, that's not my job, that's God's job. Maybe a person who's an illegal, or a person who's a homosexual, or a person who's another race, ethnicity, religion, is a better person than I. That's not for me to judge. That's something for God to judge. So that's basically where I come from. And I would like to sort of just reiterate the fact that if there are things that are being done that are issues, for example, when you look at illegally, other people talk about it, it's like, oh my gosh, like all the drug trafficking and all that stuff. Well, those are problems that definitely do need to be addressed. You just don't close your eyes. Or if you've seen this pathetic behavior going on at State, for example. I mean, that's not acceptable behavior. And that, and those sort of things obviously do need to be addressed, so that we just don't close our eyes to those things. But we do it in a way that's compassionate, we do it in a way that's objective, and we do it in a way that's merciful and compassionate, like our God intended us to do it. So thank you.
In Jain, there's one kind of a saying, or kind of a motto or principle that says, live and help others live. Doesn't define others. Others means all categories. So whether it's illegal immigrant or homosexual, doesn't define that. Basically, it says to help others. What Jains believe, there are two events. One event is, let's take illegal immigrant as one event. They are here. They are living their life. That's their event. If they need help, your job is to help them. You are doing your part, not questioning whether they deserve it, not deserve it. If they need help, you do it. That's your part. Their part will be handled by the state or by religious organization or whatever. That is their karma, what we call their karma. Your karma is to help others. So it's very simple, live and help others live.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Yes, ma'am.
I would really like the opinion of the panel on, since the teaching of compassion, as you said, is in all faiths, how come there are so many wars on the issues of faith? I would just like your input on that.
Simple question.
I think a lot of people like that.
In 5 words.
Yes.
Man, if I hadn't answered that question, we would all be very happy people. But, I mean, that's a really, really good question, excellent question, in fact, and I often think of that, and in fact, my children ask me those sort of questions, and those precocious kids, but better questions than I have answers. But, when you really look at it, I mean, from a faith perspective, we believe that this life, of course, we're here for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 more years. And this life, I mean, all of us, maybe 100 years, or hopefully maybe 200 years from now, are not going to be here. We're not. Our life is finite, and it ends. And so in that sense, the Muslim faith believes that this world is a test, right? And we're all sort of being judged on how we behave towards each other. And it's when our faith means different things to different people. Some people believe so emphatically in some of the things. For example, I would use the example of my own faith. My daughter is a student at North Canyon High School International Baccalaureate Program. She recently did a 3,000-word essay, and it was about the Taliban, and it was about extremism, And she talked about this extremism. Really good paper, a little biased. She talked about the fact that how it's like a cloud of ignorance. That it's a cloud that, when they look at some of the things, they might take a particular verse out of the Quran and completely twist it. And it may be, for example, one verse is, I'm sure you've heard this, they talk about, if you find an infidel behind any bush, kill that infidel. I'm sure you've all heard. But very few people know the context of that verse. That verse was isolated to one battle. It was isolated to a time period where the religion was trying to survive, where Muslims were being persecuted and trying to be wiped out. And in that sense, it was like saying, okay, if you find an infidel, meaning not for all time, but for that battle, you can slay that person. In the same sense, if we talk today, I would be very comfortable saying, if you find Al-Qaeda behind any bush, please slay them. I don't care if they're Muslim or Martian, but their behavior is just aberrant and wrong. And it's very easy, and that's where we have to draw the line between what's right and what's faith, because that's not acceptable. So in the same sense, where you have dogma, when you have these emphatic extremists in my own faith say, well, homosexuals should be thrown off a cliff. I mean, that's the punishment for homosexuals. Okay, what if that homosexual feeds the poor? What if they're taking care of orphans? What if they're taking care of animals? What if they're helping people? What if they're a good person? How does that make that right? I mean, and God, in the infinite wisdom, has given us a mind to differentiate between right and wrong. So in other words, we're given this freedom of choice, and that's where we need to test that. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't employ that. They take a particular verse, and you look at any scripture or any, and not just my own faith, other faith, that may be perceived as marginal, and then you say, well, geez, I'm right and you're wrong. Well, I think that's what needs to be focused on, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to sort of look into that and really sort of try to come out and present that in a positive way.
That's a $64,000 question. Well, I could go on and on that, but I'm going to touch on just a couple of things. And one is, the Buddha talks a lot about attachment. And that human beings, when he came up with what he called the 12-point chain of causation. We talk about cause and effect and dependent origination, which is what Peach talked about, where we're all connected. And one of the things he said is that, in every human being's life, we have 10 different worlds. It's what we call the 10 worlds lecture. But at the lower level of the 10 worlds that human beings go through is hell, hunger, and animality. And then the middle worlds deal with realization and learning and absorption. And then the higher world is Buddhahood, and Buddhahood represents enlightenment. But what he said is that dependent origination illustrates that as a step-by-step relationship between ignorance and suffering. That is what he was talking about. And that when people operate in the low worlds of hell, hunger, and animality, whatever world they have been brought up in, whatever world that culture has been attached to, will manifest itself sometimes in conflict, sometimes in destruction, sometimes in war. The world that he places a lot of emphasis on, and Mr. Dashman wrote a lot of letters about it, was the world of anger. And the world of anger is the most destructive, because that is the world in which the seeds of war begin to form. And that is the attachment of ownership. Now, we're not saying you can't own anything, we're not anti-owning, but what he's talking about is that the dependent origination, that once it becomes part of the culture, when it becomes the human being's psyche, part of his life condition, that world of anger, of people wanting what somebody else has. If you look at the seeds of war, it is always a fight over property, people, slavery, money, all things that have nothing to do with the true human essence of purity, good, and enlightenment. And that when people are in those low worlds, they are unable to discern the true reality of what their life is. They can't see it. It's clouded. So it's like they're attached to that particular world, and they just go back and forth between these low worlds until they are taught or they're shown how to escape the suffering, how to do it. And in many, many cultures, they did not know how, or they were taught exactly what this is saying. They were taught that this was the way in which you became successful. This is the way you had to live. And in many, many cases, a lot of the people really were not able to really discern for themselves because the leaders led them into war. And so when you have this side of the road with the people who are in compassion, the leaders, the monks, the teachers, the ministers, the people who are really bringing that message to that population, it is a very difficult process, because if they're embroiled in those lower worlds, they just can't see it. And so a lot of the time you had conflicts. Very interesting, because I was reading a book about the Crusades at one point. And when they talked about liberating the people, well, it was only half the story. So if you liberate the people and you bring religion to them, but you have to teach them how to enlighten themselves instead of oppressing them again, then it becomes more anger in a different direction. So it's a very, very complex issue. But the compassion is the antidote to war. That's our job. Very quickly tell you the story. This young lady's name is Lovera Compton. She's 17 years old. And she was just a girl when her family fled Liberia during this protracted civil war. Due to her passion for social change, she went to school, she got educated. She was selected to participate in the Strong Heart Fellowship, a program in West Africa designed to facilitate the healing, learning, and innovative thinking of young individuals displaced or orphaned by conflict and violence. In 2007, as part of the program, she created Akaweli necklace, crafted from bullet casings fired in the Civil War. The necklace features a leaf pendant inscribed with the word life. Ms. Gunter went to the children in that area, the poor children, sufferers of war, and she introduced this compass representing compassion, using this as a symbol. And she said the children were amazed. They just could not understand. And she taught them that this was the generation that was going to stop the conflict and stop the continuous war, cut it right there. And this is what she said: the most pressing issue in the world is peace. When you have compassion in your heart, you see others as your brothers and sisters. You would never think of hurting or killing them, which is what Peter said. Peace begins within and then extends to your family and neighbors. When you're happy inside, it affects the lives of everyone around you. So I read that story to say, yes, all of this has gone on, but we have hope in our young people.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
I really want to add more to what Beverly said, because it's very similar. The Jain way of looking at violence and preaching non-violence, very similar to Buddhism. So thank you, Beverly, for speaking my mind too.
That's an area I work in. Let me make a quick 2 comments about it. One is that I'm going to say it this way, one of the fictions arose with the modern nation state in the 16th, 17th, 18th century was that religion was violent. It had to be moved to the periphery of society, so it became privatistic. It needed to be individualistic. It had to do with freedom of belief, but state control of action. When you actually look at the time following the Reformation, the so-called religious wars, you had Catholics fighting Catholics. You had Protestants fighting Protestants. I'm not trying to suggest Protestants and Catholics never fought each other, but that there were never religious occasions of violence. But what I think the history of that period is now showing is that the common denominator was the nation state, and able, as Beverly said, is to get people committed to the nation state and engaging in war. I would remind you too, maybe unpopular, but I would remind you too that Christians did not attack Muslims. The United States attacked Iraq. And we did it on the basis of so-called weapons of mass destruction that did not exist. So the 20th century, there were 100 people killed per hour in the entire century. That was a century of war among nation states. And I would certainly share everyone's opinion that we need to be very clear that we're not hustled into the agenda as people of faith. We're not hustled into the agenda of any nation state and then wind up being told that's because religion is so violent we have to kill these people.
Yes, but on that issue, I hear a lot of Christians talking against Muslims,
I do, yes,
that they're a danger. So it's not only the nation state, is it?
It's not only, but I dare say if you look at why those Christians are upset, it's because they bought into the nation state ideology.
Oh, nationalism.
You make one spot.
Well, I can't agree more with what Beverly and Tex are saying, but let the blame fall where it will. Let's face it. Any way you look at it, there are 2 sides to every story, and I don't think that Muslims are sort of absolved of any blame in any way, shape, or form. There have been actions that have been committed, in Muslim totally wrong. I mean, not only do they sort of contradict the faith, but they contradict every aspect of human morality and behavior and civility. Talk about, throwing, burning schools with little girls that is happening in Afghanistan. Talk about some of the very, very poignant punishments that are happening. All these sort of things are very, very drastic things. And when you really think about it, anything that, from a Muslim perspective, I think, is sort of a good thing. It is a very good thing, in fact. So, I mean, this is a very complex question, very difficult situation, and of course, nation states act the way they act, and they use, a number of sort of, reasons to legitimize their actions. And when we talk about sort of, President Bush going into Afghanistan, and that type of oppression, makes a lot of sense from that perspective. But when you look at the collateral damage, killing hundreds and thousands of innocent children and women and that sort of thing, it paints a whole different aspect to it. So I mean, this is a very, very complex sort of a problem, and I think compassion really is sort of a common denominator where people such as ourselves can hold people accountable to, our own leaders accountable to. Hey, we need to resolve this situation. How do you resolve it with the most minimum amount of grief? You mentioned, if you're taking a 20-minute shower, can we take an 8-minute shower to resolve the problem? Whether that be strategic, strikes on specific targets, which I know is not an easy task, but that's just one example of doing certain things, because you're actually liberating those people from the tyranny of the oppressors who might be oppressing their own people. So,
I want to just point out something. This is really important. The world of anger and war. Behind the anger is tremendous fear. So sometimes people are operating from fear, which then creates anger, which then creates a negative effect towards whatever the target may be, Muslims, gays, whatever. The key, though, and I think every religion has it, and Interfaith is a perfect example, is that these people do not understand, one, the religious practices of the Muslim. Two, they don't know any Muslim people. All of their, I think, opinions are formed by what they see on the news, media, somebody told them, and they're being led. And they never had the opportunity to sit down with somebody like you and realize that he's a human being just like them. He just practices a different faith. And that is the crux of the problem, is that there's not enough dialogue and interaction between people of different races, religions, countries, cultures. That is the issue. Once you have the separatist concept, you're always going to have that fear that drives people to believe that that person is different, when in reality they're just another human being. They just operate differently, like the trees and the birds, and the whole universe is like that. It's diverse. So the key really is the dialogue, to getting to know them. And when somebody says that to you, I would recommend you say, do you know any Muslims? Are they people like that? I mean, it starts with us. And I feel very strongly about that, and I really believe it's a lot of interaction.
Tell them to contact the Arizona Interfaith Movement.
Yes, they can contact the Arizona Interfaith Movement. Absolutely.
We have a question here.
A question going way back to the origins of your religions.
Yes.
Sid, I applaud you for setting a violent reference in its historical context. That's unfortunately what has not been done in any religion over the eons, which is what leads people to their prejudices. And also, Beverly, when I assume you were translating, and yet you, in talking about your Buddhism, you talked about, you used the phrase, to cause them to abide in the law. That's a potentially volatile phrase, or to defeat those who cause oppression. So there's, in the language of the original text,
Yes.
too much, I fear, that leads subsequent, leaders to go the violent route. I mean, Islam was spread by war. Jews in Muhammad's day were taxed more than Muslims. So how do you reconcile that kind of original, practice with what you're trying to achieve today?
I think you made a very valid point. I think it has to do with trying to understand that one of the things I think that we fail to recognize is the culture, the time, and the people.
That's right.
It is really important. When we read religious types, we look at the instances in where there's similarities, that people were people, they were having fights, the husbands fought with their wives, and they beat their children, and they did the same thing. We're still doing it. But we have to understand the time, the culture, and the language. One of the things about, he was a very peaceful person. And when they're talking about causing them to, he's not talking about a conflict between two people. He's really referring about the conflict between the person's ability to overcome what he calls their ignorance. That's where he's coming from. He's talking about, my job is to preach the law, to help them. And he's very strong about it. Now let's put it in context. Gautama was a prince who came from a very wealthy family, who was very privileged, and who was brought up. So you don't, in your exposition, you don't excise that part of yourself. All of us, we bring with us what we were raised with. And so language creeps in, and sometimes the interpretation, that's where the dialogue comes. The interpretation then becomes what the other person understands according to their particular culture and their understanding. And that's what we're doing. We dialogue to really understand what is it he was trying to say. Because the thing that he always said, he said, and when you read someone and you explain it, he said, you do it gently and with compassion and using soft words. And he told his disciples, he says, when you go out and preach the law, preach what you have to say, gird yourself with my words, sit in my place, and preach it with no expectations. In other words, do not expect them to accept it. Your job is just tell it. So he definitely was a very peaceful person. But I think a lot of the language, when you read this, you realize the time and the context. And that's a very good thing to do, because that is what we have to discern and peel the layers and really understand what is the heart of the message. That's an excellent point. Thank you.
And what are you and your peers doing to help people who purport to teach religion to put things in their context?
Absolutely. And one of the things, now this is the original language, so one of the things when Nichiren Daishonin came, I'm going to give a little short history. Nichiren Daishonin came along, he was a very learned monk. He was educated. And so he put it in the perspective, he put it in the language that the people of his time could understand. And when he looked at this, he broke it down and he explained it to them. I gave you the original. He explained it to them. And then the two people who founded this organization, Ms. Jad, were educators. So they took it even further and they broke it down into the language that the common people could understand. Because the whole thread of this particular sect was bringing a religious practice to the common people who were not necessarily educated and could not understand that language at the higher levels. And what they did is they broke it down and made it as simple as possible so they didn't have to sit down and discern what it meant. And so as you look at the transition, and it takes a while, you look at how they used the original Lotus Sutra, how Nichiren Daishonin broke it down, how he wrote letters to his disciples, speaking to them in their language, talking about everyday things, the suffering, children being sick, or your husband is away, and this is what the Buddha said, and so on. And you will see the change in the language as you go along. But the context, the culture, and the people is the key. So absolutely, we have a lot of material. That is our function, that when we are doing a discussion, we always keep it in the language and the time according to the audience we're speaking to. Does that help?
It's necessary.
Absolutely.
But it's also necessary to not just to interpret for other people, but to help them understand exactly the context in which the original
Absolutely.
was stated.
Absolutely. And one of the things I have to tell you that the SGI organization, our mission, our motto mission, the quote is peace, culture, and education, which means we do a lot of studying and discussion and allow people to bring not just their perspective, but their particular culture, experience, and background, so that then we can understand each other, because that is key.
All right, how about here?
Well, I was just going to say, aligning with that, you were saying that there are two sides to every story. You know, there are 5, 6, 7, maybe 100 sides to every story. You have 100 people, you have 100 sides.
That's correct.
And the whole idea of compassion is to be able to listen and understand one of those 100 ways. But the truth is that there are so many ways. And when you have a hierarchical religion, in my opinion, you're going to have a lot of the words you must, you should, this is the law. Anybody who deviates from it is a deviant, and therefore needs to be gotten rid of. And so going back to some of those texts and looking at the words and kind of putting them into a perspective that allows the embracing is a very large task.
Yes, it is.
If I may just
Do you get into a hierarchy of the non-hierarchical?
Yes, touche. And you know, Occupy New York. Occupy right now.
Please.
Yeah, if I just may address that point, that's an excellent point. And then, look, from a Muslim perspective, you know, what makes things particularly difficult is that when you look at the Quran, every single word, every single letter of the Quran is actually considered by every Muslim, including myself, to be the authentic, actual, accurate word of God. Okay, and that's why it becomes very difficult. I mean, the scripture obviously cannot be changed. But again, God's given us common sense, and in that sense, the interpretation of those scripture and of those verses are subject to different vehicles within the faith, whether it be scholarship, whether it be consensus, whether it should be legal aspects that are certainly open to interpretation. And that's when it becomes incumbent upon us. And if you're teaching kindergartners, you don't use college texts to teach kindergartners. The same way when you look at when Islam was introduced in the world, in Saudi Arabia, in Arabia, these people were sort of at ground level when it came to, you know, many different things. And Islam was a way to refine their, you know, in comparison, refine their behaviors and make them more compassionate, that sort of thing. Now, on the same token, when you're taming a rogue elephant, you don't use please and would you kindly step over here. You know, you would use words that are, you know, that certainly, you know, the punishment, you talk about hell, and you talk about the consequences, and you talk about things that are impactful. I mean, truly, if I'm talking to, you know, a tiger, I'll just say, well, I'll take away your napkin if you don't, you know, wipe your face. You don't say things like that. But now, when we look at it, you know, the concept has changed, and things have evolved, and things have gotten really to be very different in the sense that, you know, I hear Anne thinks about like I do. Well, she's not Muslim, and I'm not her faith. But you know what? I would bet you that 99.9% of our beliefs, of our views, would be similar. I mean, I listen to Beverly, I listen to Piyush, I listen to, and my grandparents are from India, so we have a cultural bond. You know, I respect really what he's, you know, done, you know, what he talks about and some of those aspects. I cannot disagree with them being a Muslim, because those are aspects that I believe in. But like you say, and so eloquently, that those things need to be imparted upon those, and fortunately those in my faith live in the third world. They don't have education. You know, they're very devoid of some very, very basic needs of life. And you know what? When it means to have a piece of bread and to kill someone for it, and you've got some radical cleric who's telling you to die so you can feed your family. I pray to God that none of us or anyone else is ever in that situation, because these are very hard choices to make. And in that sense, being here, when I talk to some of the refugee populations that have come here from Somalia, for example, I tell them, you're the freest to practice your faith here. You know what? If you said what I'm saying today in Saudi Arabia in front of the Wahhabis, I would be not a happy person. In that sense, is that my faith? I don't think so. Because you know what? Everything I read here, that doesn't add up. It really doesn't. And they can quote whatever type of thing. And when you talk about terrorism, there's a cleric an imam, actually, and that's the same word for cleric in England, Tahir al-Qadri. Google his name. If you read about him, he's issued a fatwa, just like thousands of pages, involving against terrorism, every single aspect of it. And we want scholarship. The scholarship is there. So it's not that it's devoid, but like you say, the message needs to be clearly imparted upon those. And when you talk about, for example, a question in particular presentation that I was making was brought up that, hey, in Islam's other faiths were taxed more than Muslims. Well, you have to realize that those non-Muslims at that time were not required to do charity and not required to do all those sort of things. So for the protection, there was a tax required of them. But is that useful today? Well, no. I mean, is it useful not to have any churches in Saudi Arabia? Well, heck no. I can say that as a Muslim because you know what? It doesn't jive, folks. Two and two don't add up here. So, there is no compulsion in faith. It just says, chapter 2, verse 256, let there be no compulsion in religion. That's black and white. That's not maybe. So.
I don't know who was next.